Hello everyone, before we begin tonight's haunting tale, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of the fear. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time the unknown feels closest to you. The air had a peculiar weight to it, as though it was saturated with the passage of time. I had always found solace in the forgotten corners of the world, places that held secrets, memories, and fragments of lives once lived. And so, when I heard the rumors about the abandoned palace, nestled deep within the woods of Thornfield, I knew I had to see it for myself. I had always been drawn to history's hidden places, old houses, forgotten estates, anything that whispered of the past. Most people would walk right past the crumbling remnants of time, too afraid of what they might find, or worse, what might find them. But not me. I was a historian at heart, and there was no mystery that didn't call to me, no puzzle I wouldn't try to solve. The palace had been uninhabited for centuries, ever since the infamous witch, Ilara, was said to have cursed it and its surroundings. Some of the locals told stories of how Ilara had once been the queen's closest advisor, a powerful woman who commanded the magic of the land. But when the king betrayed her, they say she exacted her revenge, cursing not just the royal family but the very soil the palace was built upon. Some claimed she still haunted the ruins, her spirit bound to the palace by the magic she'd cast. It was easy to dismiss these stories as mere superstition, something to keep the curious away. But there was something about the way the villagers spoke of the place, their eyes darting nervously when the topic came up. They were afraid of something. And when I learned that no one had dared step foot inside the palace in generations, it became clear that there was more to the tale than just a disgruntled sorceress. That was enough to pull me in. I'd heard the stories too many times to count the cursed halls, the ominous whispers in the night, the flickering shadows that moved of their own accord. They said the trees around the palace never grew tall, their leaves thin and sickly, as if the land itself were suffering from some ancient wound. And the palace itself? It stood as though it were defying time, its stone walls cracked, its once grand towers leaning precariously. Even the roof sagged, as if bowing to some unseen weight. The morning I arrived, the fog hung thick in the air, a low mist that clung to the earth, making every step feel as though it was a trespass into forbidden territory. The woods were unnaturally still, no birds singing, no wind rustling the leaves. It was as though the forest itself had been muted, holding its breath. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickle, but I brushed it off. Fear, after all, was just the mind's way of protecting itself from the unknown. As I approached the palace's massive iron gates, I noticed the intricate carvings on the stone pillars. Ancient symbols, runes, perhaps wove in and out of the structure, curling like snakes around the columns. They were worn down with age, their meanings lost to time. But one thing was certain, these symbols weren't mere decoration. They were warnings, left by whoever had built the palace to keep intruders away. I paused at the gates, feeling an odd sense of hesitation creep over me. They stood ajar, as though someone, or something, had been waiting for me. The air around me grew colder, and I could swear I heard a faint whisper. A woman's voice, soft and melodic, calling out from deep within the walls. But there was no one there, no other soul in sight. I shook my head. It was nothing. Just my imagination. Inside, the palace loomed larger than I had anticipated. The grand entrance hall was vast, its high ceilings stretching above me like a cavern. Old tapestries hung on the walls, their once vibrant colors faded into muted shadows. The floors creaked beneath my boots, and the air smelled of mildew and old wood. Every step I took seemed to reverberate, echoing throughout the empty halls. But it wasn't just the silence that struck me, it was the absence of life. The stillness was oppressive, unnatural. As though the very soul of the palace had been frozen in time, suspended in some moment of tragedy or unfinished business. I had read that the witch Ilara was known to have loved the palace more than anything. In her final days, it was said she wandered these halls endlessly, cursing everything she had once adored. And now, her curse lingered in every corner, every shadow, every crack in the stone. I wandered deeper into the palace, following the winding corridors, each more labyrinthine than the last. It was as though the walls themselves were shifting, subtly rearranging, leading me to places I hadn't meant to go. The deeper I ventured, the darker it became. The candlelight from my lantern flickered and sputtered, casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. And then, I found it. A door, hidden behind an ancient, decaying tapestry. I pushed it open with a creak, revealing a room unlike the others. This one was different, unnaturally cold. The air inside felt thick, like it had been trapped for centuries. My lantern illuminated the stone walls, revealing strange markings carved into the surface. The room seemed almost sacred, untouched by time's decay. At the far end of the room, a mirror stood, its frame adorned with twisted vines, their sharp edges curling like talons. It was massive, larger than any mirror I had ever seen. Its surface was dark, almost black, reflecting nothing but emptiness. The strange thing was, when I looked into it, I didn't just see my reflection. I saw something else, something wrong. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging the glass, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. No one. My heart raced. I could feel a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as though I wasn't alone. As though the mirror itself was watching me. I stepped back, unsure of what I had seen. But as I looked at the mirror again, I could have sworn I saw the faintest outline of a figure in the reflection, its face twisted in sorrow, its eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. The figure seemed to be beckoning me, urging me to come closer. I shook my head, willing myself to be rational. It was just a trick of the light. Just my imagination playing tricks on me. But even as I turned to leave the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I had just crossed some invisible line, and I wasn't sure I could turn back. As I made my way back to the grand hallway, I couldn't help but notice the temperature had dropped. The chill in the air was suffocating, seeping into my bones. I pulled my coat tighter around me, but it did little to ward off the growing sense of dread. Every step I took felt heavier, as though the palace itself was pressing down on me, urging me to leave, to run. But I couldn't. Not yet. The more I explored, the more I felt the pull of the palace, the pull of the witch's curse. And in the back of my mind, I knew something I didn't want to admit. I had come here for more than just the history. I had come for the mystery of Alara, for the stories that had whispered in the shadows. And now, I was part of the story, whether I liked it or not. The palace was full of contradictions. On one hand, it was a marvel, a forgotten piece of history, its intricate architecture still capable of drawing awe. On the other hand, it felt like something was terribly, painfully wrong. The deeper I ventured into the forgotten corners of the palace, the more I realized that it wasn't merely a building, it was a living, breathing entity, its heart beating in time with mine, echoing through the empty halls. Each room seemed to hold a secret of its own, whispers of a lifelong past but not forgotten. I tried to push past the eerie feeling gnawing at my thoughts, telling myself that it was nothing more than the natural weight of abandonment. Yet the longer I stayed, the more impossible it became to ignore the sense that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone. In the days that followed my arrival, I spent every waking hour exploring the depths of the palace. The sunlight barely touched the stone floors, the heavy drapes on the windows casting long, dark shadows. Dust hung in the air, as though time itself had settled here, untouched. But despite its state of decay, there was an undeniable presence in the palace, a pull I couldn't quite explain. I began to delve into the palace's history, finding old books and dusty journals hidden beneath rotting floorboards or locked away in forgotten cabinets. The name Alara appeared repeatedly in these accounts, often in hushed tones, as though speaking it aloud would invoke some sort of dark magic. She wasn't just a queen or a noblewoman, she was something more, a sorceress, a witch who had made a pact with powers beyond mortal comprehension. She was said to be as beautiful as she was powerful, with eyes that could pierce through the veil of reality, seeing things no one else could. But the deeper I went into her story, the more disturbing the accounts became. Alara had been betrayed, both by the king she loved and the people she ruled. Her jealousy and rage had turned to dark sorcery, her curses powerful enough to turn the very earth beneath the palace's foundation against its inhabitants. The king had tried to imprison her, but instead, she had bound herself to the palace, her spirit trapped by the very magic she had conjured. The journals told of a mirror, one that had been placed in the heart of the palace, a relic of Alara's magic. They said that anyone who gazed into the mirror would see more than just their reflection. They would see the past, the present, and perhaps even the future. But it came with a price. The mirror was not just a window to time, but a gateway to something darker, something that had no place in the world of the living. I found the mirror on the third day of my exploration. It was hidden in a small, forgotten room at the end of a narrow hallway, its door half covered by a tattered velvet curtain that seemed to have been deliberately draped over it, as though trying to keep the room from being found. My heart raced as I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking with an unsettling sound that echoed throughout the quiet palace. The air inside was cooler than the rest of the building, thick with an almost palpable sense of history, as if the walls themselves held their breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, there it was. The mirror. It stood tall against the far wall, its frame dark and twisted, with intricate carvings of vines and symbols I couldn't immediately understand. The glass was dark, almost black, and the reflection it offered was not that of the room, but of something else, something wrong. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shift in the shadows within the mirror. But when I stepped closer, all I saw was my own reflection, my wide eyes, the way the lantern light flickered off my face. I stared at myself for a moment, mesmerized by the strange stillness of the room, the way the air felt thick, like it was holding onto something unspoken. And then, just as I was about to turn away, something changed. My reflection shifted. Not in a physical way, but in an almost imperceptible manner. My face twisted, and the eyes that stared back at me no longer looked like my own. They were dark, full of sadness, full of something else I couldn't place. The woman staring back at me wasn't me, at least not entirely. It was Ilara. Her figure stood behind mine in the mirror, her image faint, but unmistakable. She was draped in robes as dark as the night, her long, black hair flowing like a river of ink. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with an intensity that both fascinated and terrified me. She seemed to be watching me. No, not watching. She was waiting. My heart pounded in my chest, and I took a hesitant step back, but the image in the mirror didn't change. Ilara's reflection stayed, staring right at me, as though she could see me, too. Her lips parted, as though about to speak, but I couldn't hear anything, no sound reached my ears. It was as though the mirror had stolen her voice, trapping her words behind the glass. I stood frozen in place, my breath coming in shallow bursts. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? The room felt too quiet, too heavy, the air so thick I could hardly breathe. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone else standing in the room with me, or worse, something watching me from the corners of the palace. But no one was there. I was alone. And yet, I wasn't. A soft voice, almost a whisper, echoed in my mind, so faint I could hardly make out the words. "You have found me," it said, and I felt my blood run cold. The voice was unmistakably hers. Ilara's. I stumbled backward, my hand clutching the doorframe for support as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing together like the jaws of some terrible beast. It was then that I noticed something else, something that made my skin crawl. The symbols on the mirror's frame, they were glowing. A pale blue light pulsed from the carvings, swirling around the edges, drawing my attention to them. The light flickered, as though the mirror was coming to life, awakening after centuries of slumber. The air was thick with magic, an energy so potent it felt as though I could reach out and touch it. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave the room, to escape the madness that was slowly closing in around me. But my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place, held captive by something I couldn't explain. And then, as I stood there, staring at the mirror, something changed. The reflection of Ilara began to move. Her image didn't remain locked in place anymore. She was alive, stepping forward, reaching out with long, graceful fingers. The mirror seemed to shimmer as she approached, the glass bending and warping as though it were alive, too. "You are here," Ilara whispered, her voice now clear in my mind. "You are the one." My heart pounded. The words didn't make sense. What did she mean by the one? Suddenly, everything snapped into focus. The palace had drawn me here for a reason. It wasn't just the history that had intrigued me, it was something deeper, something that had been waiting for me. Ilara's curse had not been forgotten. It had been alive, waiting for the right person to unlock it, waiting for someone who could release it from its prison. And now, that person was me. I staggered back, my hand pressing against the cold stone wall, my mind racing. The palace wasn't just haunted by Ilara's spirit, it was the prison she had created, the place where her magic had been bound. The mirror wasn't just a reflection, it was a doorway. A gateway to something darker, something older than time itself. I had discovered something far more dangerous than I could have imagined. And Ilara was no longer just a shadow in the mirror. She was real, and she was waiting for me to make a choice. I should have left. Every instinct told me to turn back, to flee the palace and never return. But the pull was undeniable, like a magnet drawing me closer. I couldn't explain it, but every step deeper into the palace only made me feel more connected to the place, to the mystery that now wrapped itself around me like a cold, suffocating cloak. In the days following my discovery of the mirror, the palace felt different. The walls seemed to shift subtly, as if they were alive, as if they were watching me. The air was heavier, thicker, and the once still rooms now felt filled with an unsettling presence. Each time I walked through the corridors, I could feel something following me, something in the shadows, waiting to reveal itself. It wasn't just the weight of history that weighed on me anymore, it was the very essence of the palace alive with magic, with malevolent intent. The whispers began. It started small, a soft rustling sound in the corners of my mind, something I could almost ignore. But the longer I stayed, the louder the voices became, until I could hear them clearly, as if they were right next to me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, the creaking of the old building. But the whispers had a quality to them, a tone that chilled me to the bone. They weren't just sounds, they were words, ancient and familiar, calling my name. Ilara, the whisper would echo down the halls, and I would stop dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was never anyone around. I was alone. Or so I thought. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows in the palace deepened, I ventured deeper into the east wing, an area I hadn't explored yet. The air in that part of the palace felt different, more oppressive, as though the very atmosphere was thick with something unnatural. The walls seemed to close in on me as I walked through the narrow corridors, the faded tapestries now heavy with the weight of untold stories. I turned a corner and found myself standing in front of a door I hadn't noticed before. It was made of dark wood, carved with intricate symbols, some that matched the ones on the mirror, others that were entirely unfamiliar. A shiver ran down my spine as I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and grasped the cold metal handle. The door creaked open slowly, the sound deafening in the otherwise silent hallway. Inside was a room I hadn't expected. It was smaller than the grand halls, but it felt somehow more intimate, more personal. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars and bottles, each one containing strange, dark substances. There were books, ancient and worn, scattered across a long wooden table, their pages yellowed with age. And at the center of the room stood a large stone altar, covered in dust and cobwebs. My lantern flickered as I stepped inside, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with the scent of something old, something forgotten. And then, my eyes fell on something that made my heart skip a beat. Atop the altar lay a single object, covered in a tattered cloth. I couldn't resist the urge to lift the cloth, my fingers shaking as I uncovered the object beneath. It was a pendant, simple yet striking, with a symbol I had seen before, a symbol carved into the mirror's frame. The moment I touched the pendant, a sudden rush of cold flooded over me, as if the very essence of the room had shifted. I gasped, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts, as the room seemed to grow colder, darker. The air felt thick with an energy that buzzed in my ears, and for a moment, everything around me seemed to vibrate. The shadows on the walls stretched and twisted, warping into shapes that didn't belong. I stumbled back, clutching the pendant in my hand, unable to tear my eyes away from the shifting forms in the room. And then, I heard it, the voice. Ilara, the whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't in my head. It was real. The words drifted toward me like a wind, curling around my thoughts, pulling at my very soul. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, yet the presence was unmistakable, filling the space with a heavy, palpable dread. I turned toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I needed to leave. I had to leave. But as I reached for the door handle, something stopped me. The air grew thick, the pressure around me building until I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred as the walls seemed to close in, the shadows in the room lengthening, stretching toward me like dark fingers. The whispers grew louder, until they filled my ears, drowning out all other sound. "Help me." The voice was no longer a whisper, it was a plea, a cry for help that echoed through the very core of my being. I turned, my eyes wild with fear, and there, standing at the far side of the room, was Alara. But she wasn't the figure I had seen in the mirror. She was solid, tangible, her form now a ghostly apparition, her face twisted in agony. Her eyes locked onto mine, dark and sorrowful, as though she were reaching out to me from beyond the veil. "Please," Alara's voice was desperate, her hands outstretched as though begging for something. "You have to help me." I took a step back, my pulse racing. The shadows around her twisted, growing more distorted with each passing second. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my chest. "I can't help you. I don't know how." Her gaze softened, and for a moment, I could see a flicker of humanity in her eyes, a glimpse of the woman she once was. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by something far darker. Her form shifted, becoming more ethereal, more distant. The shadows around her pulsed, vibrating with energy, and I could feel the power that emanated from her. It was the same energy I had felt earlier, in the room with the mirror, but now it was alive, vibrating with an intensity one couldn't understand. "You have already helped me," Alara's voice was soft, almost like a sigh. "You are the one who has freed me." My heart lurched in my chest as the realization hit me like a blow. It wasn't that I had come to uncover the palace's mysteries, I had come to unearth something far darker. I wasn't just here to study Alara, I had awakened her. I had broken the seal that bound her, and now, there was no going back. The room began to warp around me, the walls twisting like liquid, the shadows growing long and monstrous. I couldn't escape. The very palace itself seemed to be pulling me deeper into its grasp, its magic now unleashed, its power flowing through me. The pendant in my hand burned with an intensity that made my skin prickle, and I realized too late that I had become a part of something far beyond my comprehension. The ground beneath me trembled as if the palace itself was waking from a long slumber, stretching its dark limbs into the world. The door slammed shut, trapping me inside the room, and the shadows closed in. I could hear Alara's voice again, but it wasn't comforting. It was triumphant. "You have freed me," she whispered once more, and this time, I couldn't deny it. The magic that had bound her for so long was no more. She was free, and so was the darkness she had summoned. The palace was alive with her power, and it was hungry. Hungry for more. The palace had become a living nightmare, its walls pulsing with magic that bent reality itself. Every breath I took was thick with an ancient, suffocating power, and every shadow seemed to flicker with hidden eyes, watching me, waiting for something. The realization hit me harder than any blow could. The palace, with its dark history, its endless halls, its very heart, was no longer just the home of a ghost, it was a breeding ground for something far worse. Alara wasn't simply a trapped spirit. She had been the architect of the palace's curse, the dark heart of its malevolent energy, and I had unwittingly set her free. I had no idea how much time had passed since that moment in the hidden room, the one with the pendant, where Alara's ghostly form had emerged from the shadows and taken her first steps into the world once more. The clocks in the palace had stopped, and so had my sense of reality. What was once a grand, albeit crumbling, estate had transformed into a labyrinth of shifting corridors, rooms that rearranged themselves as I walked through them, and whispers that clawed at the edges of my sanity. It wasn't just the palace that had come to life. It was me, too. The magic had touched me, and now it was in my blood, running through my veins, laced with an unrelenting hunger. I should have left. I should have never touched that cursed pendant, never opened that damnable door. But now it was too late. Every corner of the palace seemed to bear Alara's mark, her dark, twisted presence permeating the air. And I knew, deep down, that there was no way out anymore. I ran. I don't know what I expected to find in my frantic search for escape, perhaps a way out through the crumbling gates of the palace or a door that hadn't yet been consumed by the magic that bound this place. But the deeper I ventured, the more I realized the truth. There was no escape. Not anymore. The hallway stretched on forever, like a never-ending tunnel, each step echoing through the silence, yet filled with an oppressive weight that made every movement feel like it took 1,000 years. The palace, now dark and distorted, seemed to close in around me. The walls narrowed with every passing second, the air thick with an unseen pressure. And then, there it was again, the whisper. That same voice, but louder this time, closer. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was as though it was coming from the very walls themselves. Ilara. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, my eyes darting back and forth through the endless hall. There was no one. No movement. But the walls seemed to breathe. The shadows writhed, as if something was trying to break free from within them. The temperature dropped, and my breath misted in the air. The darkness around me grew heavier, more oppressive. It was as if the palace itself was alive, its very foundations crawling with the darkness Ilara had unleashed. And then, there she was. Ilara appeared before me in an instant, stepping out from the shadows with an almost unnatural grace. Her form was no longer the ghostly apparition it had been before. She was solid, as real as anything I had ever seen, yet her presence seemed to twist the world around her. Her long, black hair cascaded around her like a veil of night, and her eyes, those haunting, dark eyes, locked onto mine. They were no longer filled with desperation. No, now they were filled with triumph. "You are here," Ilara whispered, her voice cold and powerful, filled with an ancient strength that seemed to shake the very air around us. "You have awakened me. You have released me." I took a step back, my pulse quickening. "I didn't mean to," I gasped, my voice trembling. "I didn't." But she cut me off with a raised hand, her fingers crackling with an unnatural energy. The air around her shimmered with dark magic, and I could feel the power emanating from her like a wave, crashing over me. It was suffocating, overwhelming. I could taste it in the air, like burning copper, like blood. "You are the key," she said, her voice low and menacing. "The pendant you touched, the spell you triggered, it has broken the seal. And now, there is nothing left to stop me." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. The pendant. The seal. I had unwittingly played a part in this nightmare. I hadn't just set Ilara free, I had opened the door to something far darker than I could comprehend. The magic she had bound to herself all those centuries ago was now spilling out into the world, flowing like an uncontrollable river, and the palace, her prison, was just the beginning. Her smile was twisted, a cruel, knowing thing that sent a chill racing down my spine. She stepped closer, and I could feel the energy around her crackling, pulling at me like an invisible force. The shadows seemed to reach for her, as if eager to wrap themselves around her, to claim her as their own. And they were. They were alive, responding to her every command. "Do you not see, little one?" Ilara's voice was now a whisper in my ear, sharp as a blade. "This place is mine. It was never a prison. It was never meant to hold me. It was meant to protect the world from me." The ground beneath my feet trembled, and I could feel the palace shifting once more. The walls warped, the air growing thicker with each passing second. It was as though the very essence of the palace was twisting to her will. The floors groaned under the weight of centuries of magic, and the air became charged with an electric energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "No," I gasped, my legs shaking as I stumbled backward. "You can't. You can't." But Ilara was already upon me, her hand outstretched, her fingers crackling with power. The shadows seemed to follow her like obedient servants, swirling around her as she reached for me. I tried to back away, but the air was too thick, too heavy. I was trapped. There was nowhere to run. "You have no choice." Ilara's voice was almost a purr now, seductive and dangerous. "You have already released me. You are my instrument. You are the one who will help me claim what is mine." The shadows surged toward me, and I felt the air constrict around my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. My heart raced, and I could feel the magic, that dark, suffocating magic, swirling around me like a storm. It was too much. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The power of the palace, of Elara, was overwhelming. I closed my eyes, feeling myself slipping into unconsciousness, the world around me twisting and fading. But just before the darkness claimed me, something snapped. A sudden, searing pain shot through my chest, and I gasped in shock. My eyes flew open, and there, hovering before me, was the pendant, the one I had found, the one I had unwittingly touched, now glowing with an intense, blinding light. It wasn't just a pendant. It was the final key. The last piece of Elara's curse, the thing that had bound her in the first place. And in that moment, I understood what I had to do. I reached for the pendant, my hand trembling as I grasped it tightly. The light from it burned my skin, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I had to stop her. Elara, I cried out, my voice hoarse, raw. You are not free. Not yet. The words fell from my lips like a spell, and the room seemed to shake. Elara's eyes widened in shock as the shadows around her began to writhe, as if they were being pulled back, torn from their hold on her. The pendant in my hand pulsed with light, brighter than ever, and I felt its magic surge through me like a bolt of lightning. No, Elara screamed, her voice filled with rage. But it was too late. The light from the pendant enveloped her, searing through the shadows and binding them once more. The palace trembled violently, and I could feel the curse being undone, the magic that had bound Elara to this place finally being restored. The shadows shrieked as they were pulled back into the depths of the palace, sealing the witch in her prison once again. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the chaos stopped. The room fell silent. The air cleared. The darkness receded. Elara was gone. The echoes of Elara's screams still lingered in my mind, the memory of her rage a dark cloud that clouded my thoughts. Even though I had driven her back, even though the curse had been undone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within me. The palace, once a place of mystery and decay, now felt like a silent tomb, its halls empty and still. The weight that had pressed down on me during my time in the palace had finally lifted, but with it came a profound emptiness. The walls of the palace, now quiet, seemed to have settled into an eerie calm. No longer did the shadows writhe at the corners of my vision, no longer did the air hum with magic. But the silence was oppressive. It was as if the house itself was mourning the loss of its dark mistress, mourning the absence of the power that had once held it together. I could still feel the remnants of Elara's curse hanging in the air, like a faint, acrid scent that refused to fade. I stood at the entrance to the main hall, staring out through the cracked glass of the double doors. The storm had passed, and the night outside was calm. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a soft, silver light over the landscape. The palace, once a living, breathing entity of fear and magic, now seemed like nothing more than an abandoned shell, empty, silent, and cold. The pendant still burned in my palm, its once blinding light now dimmed to a faint glow, as though it too had exhausted itself in the battle against Elara's malevolent power. I could feel the warmth of it, though. It had changed, just as I had. The connection between us, forged in the depths of the palace's curse, had become something different now. No longer a tool of dark magic, the pendant now felt like a bond, a reminder of what had happened, what I had faced, and what I had lost. My hand tightened around the pendant as the realization struck me. I had lost more than just my peace. I had lost something deeper, something that I couldn't explain, but something I could feel in every fiber of my being. I had gone into that palace seeking answers, seeking closure for the mysteries that haunted me. But what I had found was far more than I had ever bargained for. I had faced the darkest part of myself, and in the process, I had awakened something that had been dormant within me all along. Elara's power wasn't just gone. It had bled into me, leaving traces of its darkness embedded in my soul. I felt it there, lurking just beneath the surface, a constant reminder of the power I had unleashed. It was as though the magic of the palace had imprinted itself on me, transforming me in ways I couldn't understand. The line between what had been real and what had been supernatural had blurred beyond recognition. I was no longer just the person who had stumbled into that cursed house seeking answers. I was something else now, something tied to the darkness that had once held the palace in its grip. The sound of footsteps behind me jolted me from my thoughts. I turned quickly, instinctively, expecting to see Ilara standing there, her form emerging from the shadows. But it was only the butler, Mr. Brackett. His once perfect suit was now disheveled, his eyes tired and hollow. He had been with me through this entire ordeal, yet I couldn't remember if I had ever truly understood who he was or what role he had played in the palace's dark history. "I didn't think you would come back," he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. "I thought you'd leave, like everyone else." "I almost did," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But I couldn't leave. Not without knowing." Mr. Brackett nodded slowly, his face a mask of sorrow. "You've done what no one else could do," he said. "You've freed us all." "Freed you?" I asked, confusion flickering across my face. "But Ilara." "No," he interrupted, his voice sharp, almost desperate. "Ilara is gone. For good. And so is the curse. The palace can finally rest." He paused, his expression softening. "But you are different now. And I can see it in your eyes. You carry her magic with you." The words hit me like a blow, and I staggered back, my heart racing. Had I really changed so much? Had the darkness that had once consumed the palace found a new vessel in me? Was I now bound to that place, to its curse, for the rest of my life? "I didn't ask for this," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No one asks for this kind of power," Mr. Brackett replied, his voice low, almost pitying. "But it's yours now, whether you want it or not. The magic of the palace is part of you, and the choice is yours. You can leave it behind, but it will never truly let you go." I didn't know how to respond to that. What could I say? How could I come to terms with what I had become? How could I face the world knowing that a part of Ilara's dark magic would forever be a part of me? The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, until Mr. Brackett spoke again. "I'll stay here," he said quietly. "I'll make sure the palace is kept in order. And I'll keep its secrets safe." I turned away from him, my gaze drifting to the darkened windows, to the world beyond. For the first time in days, the weight on my chest felt lighter. Ilara's curse had been broken, the palace's magic sealed once more. But I could still feel her presence, a whisper in the corners of my mind, a reminder of what I had done and what I had become. "I have to go," I said softly. "I need to find a way to live with this. To live with what I've unleashed." "You will," Mr. Brackett replied, his voice filled with a quiet assurance. "But you'll never be the same again. None of us are." As I stepped out of the palace, into the cool night air, I felt the full weight of his words. The world beyond the palace seemed unchanged, as though everything had gone on without me, as though the horrors I had experienced were nothing more than a passing nightmare. But I knew better. I knew that the darkness within me would never fade. It would follow me, like a shadow, forevermore. The storm had passed. The palace had fallen silent. But the witch's legacy, the magic, the curse, was still alive, and it was now a part of me. The sound of the car tires crunching against the long, gravel driveway was a familiar one that had played in the background of my childhood summers, just as much a part of the landscape as the towering trees and the low, sprawling hills. It was the sound of return. Yet, this time, it was different. The air, thick with the musk of wet leaves and the lingering hint of dust, seemed to pulse with a quiet tension. As we made our way up the old road, I could already feel the weight of the place pressing in on me. It had been years since I last saw it, the mansion that had once been the heart of my family. I could still remember the creaking of the front door as it opened, the way the polished wood of the floors felt underfoot, the smell of old books mixed with faint traces of mothballs and perfume. This was a place that had always seemed both vast and suffocating, a labyrinth of rooms, each holding stories of generations long gone. I had been a child then, barely able to reach the brass doorknobs, running my fingers over the intricate carvings in the furniture that adorned every room, feeling a sense of both wonder and unease in the mansion's endless, echoing silence. But now, as I drove toward it, the memories felt distant, clouded by time. The house, once so full of life and warmth, was now just a relic of a past I could barely recall. The iron gates, rusted and tangled with vines, stood slightly ajar, creaking softly as if whispering a warning. My family had long since moved away, and I had only heard rumors and half-whispered conversations about the mansion's state. Some said it was falling apart, others claimed it was best left alone, that no one should set foot inside its crumbling halls. But when I received the letter, an old, yellowed envelope with my name scribbled across it in a shaky hand, I knew that I had to return. There was unfinished business, a legacy I couldn't ignore. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel as I turned the corner and saw it ahead. The mansion loomed against the backdrop of a twilight sky, its silhouette a jagged line of darkness against the soft orange glow. Its tall, broken windows reflected a faint, unsettling light, though there were no lights inside to explain it. The mansion was a forgotten monument to a different time, standing as both a witness to history and a prisoner of its own age. Its walls were overgrown with ivy and moss, hiding much of its once grand architecture. The roof was sagging in places, the wood of the porch steps warped and cracked from years of neglect. For a moment, I just sat there, parked at the end of the long, twisting drive, staring at the house. My breath caught in my chest as I realized how much it had changed, or perhaps, how much I had changed. The mansion, though decaying, still held a strange power over me, a pull I couldn't explain. There was a heaviness in the air, an electric charge that made my skin prickle. It wasn't just the overgrown trees or the shadowy corners of the property that made me uneasy, it was the sense that something was waiting for me, something hidden within the walls of the mansion itself. Finally, I gathered the strength to step out of the car. The gravel crunched underfoot as I made my way toward the front door, the once pristine path now covered in a carpet of dead leaves and broken branches. My heart pounded louder with each step, but my feet carried me forward, as if pulled by some unseen force. When I reached the front steps, I paused, taking a long look at the mansion's weathered exterior. There was something about it that felt almost alive. The mansion didn't simply stand there, cold and still, it seemed to breathe, to watch, to wait. I reached for the door, and it creaked open without a sound, the brass handle smooth under my fingers. As I stepped inside, the familiar scent of dust and old wood enveloped me. The air was thick, stagnant, as if the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to finally return. It was a far cry from the bustling place I remembered, the laughter of family, the chatter of relatives in the dining room. Now, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint rustling of the wind outside and the occasional groan of the house settling. The entryway had changed little, though time had taken its toll. The grand staircase still stood at the far end, its polished railing gleaming faintly in the dim light filtering through the broken windows. The wallpaper was peeling in some places, revealing the faded remnants of past patterns. The once vibrant red velvet curtains now hung limply from their rods, the fabric torn and frayed, barely clinging to the ancient walls. The chandelier overhead, once gleaming with crystals, now hung crookedly, its glass pieces cracked and dull. I walked deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. Each room I passed seemed frozen in time, as if the house had simply stopped living when my family left. The furniture, though covered in dust, was untouched. A rocking chair sat by the fireplace in the sitting room, its cushions faded, the wood of the chair creaking slightly with each gust of wind. A bookshelf lined the wall, filled with books I hadn't seen in years, their pages yellowed and brittle with age. The old piano in the corner stood silent, its ivory keys cracked, but still somehow inviting. It was strange how easily I slipped into the role of visitor here, as if I had never left. But even as I explored the familiar rooms, something felt wrong. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, a sense that this place, so familiar to me, had become something other. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and the farther I ventured into the house, the more I felt it. A coldness, a creeping sensation that slithered up my spine, urging me to turn back. I made my way to the dining room, where the long oak table still sat beneath a tarnished chandelier, its crystals covered in a fine layer of dust. Chairs were pushed out from the table, as though someone had recently gotten up and walked away. But there were no signs of life here. No one had been here for years. I ran my fingers along the back of one of the chairs, feeling the cold wood beneath my fingertips. It was hard to believe that this room had once been filled with warmth, with the sounds of conversation and clinking silverware. There, on the far wall, hung an old portrait, a family portrait, one I hadn't seen in years. The faces of my ancestors stared down at me from the canvas, their expressions serious and unreadable. The painting had always been a fixture in the dining room, but now it felt different. The eyes of the people in the painting seemed to follow me, watching my every move with an unsettling intensity. I stood there for a moment, studying the faces, feeling an odd chill run down my back. I couldn't help but wonder who these people were, what had they been like, and why did it feel as though they knew something I didn't. Just as I turned to walk away, I noticed something on the table, an old, leather-bound journal. Its edges were frayed, the cover cracked from years of wear. It looked as though it had been left there for someone to find. My curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. The handwriting was old, but still legible, though the ink had faded in some places. It was a journal belonging to one of my ancestors, written during the early days of the mansion's construction. The entries were filled with mundane details, but as I read on, the tone began to shift. There were mentions of strange noises at night, of shadows moving in the corners of rooms, of things that couldn't be explained. I paused at one entry, my eyes scanning the words. The house seems to be watching us. It has a life of its own, a presence that grows stronger with each passing day. I hear whispers when I'm alone, and sometimes I wake to find things out of place, furniture shifted, doors left ajar. We must leave before it consumes us. A chill ran through me as I closed the journal, my thoughts racing. What had my ancestor experienced here? And why had they never left a warning for us? The house, it seemed, was not just a building, it was something far darker, something far older. And whatever it was, it had been waiting for my return. I placed the journal back on the table, my heart pounding in my chest. The air around me seemed to grow colder still, the silence more oppressive. It was as though the house had been holding its breath, waiting for me to uncover its secrets. And now that I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made the worst mistake of my life. The longer I wandered through the mansion's decaying halls, the more I felt as though I were walking through a place suspended between time, a forgotten world trapped in the amber of history. The house, once a grand testament to my family's wealth and status, had long since surrendered to neglect. Dust lay heavy in the air, coating everything in a fine, grey film. The floors creaked with every step I took, each noise amplified in the silence that clung to the walls. There was no comfort to be found here anymore, no warmth or welcome. Yet, despite the overwhelming sense of decay and abandonment, something kept pulling me deeper into the house, urging me to uncover more. I had to understand what had happened here. The letter, the journal, there was something that needed to be uncovered, some truth hidden within these walls. As the shadows grew longer with the setting sun, I found myself standing before a door I didn't remember ever opening as a child. It was a small door, tucked away behind an old armoire in the hallway. I had passed it countless times growing up, always assuming it was just another closet or utility room. But now, something about it felt different. The door stood slightly ajar, a faint creaking sound emanating from within as though it had been waiting for me to open it. A cold draft seeped from the gap, sending a shiver down my spine. I reached out and pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that rushed up from the basement was cold, musty, thick with the scent of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place. There was no turning back now. I had come this far, and whatever waited below had been beckoning me. I hesitated for only a moment before I stepped forward, my heart beating loudly in my chest as I descended into the unknown. The staircase seemed to go on forever, the steps worn smooth with age. Each one creaked under my weight, and the farther I went, the colder it became. The air in the basement was stifling, as if the space had not been disturbed for decades. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself standing in a room that felt smaller than the vastness of the rest of the house. The walls were lined with shelves, but the objects on them were unlike anything I had seen before, strange, old artifacts that seemed almost out of place, as if they didn't belong in a house like this. My eyes fell upon a large, ornate mirror standing against the far wall. It was framed in dark, twisted wood, the edges carved into intricate patterns that almost seemed to shift in the dim light. The mirror's surface was cracked, though the cracks seemed to have been there for a long time. But even in its broken state, it had an eerie, hypnotic quality to it. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. There was something wrong about it, something unsettling that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I took a step closer, drawn to the mirror as if by some invisible force. As I stood before it, my reflection seemed to flicker, distorting as though it were being submerged in water. I blinked, shaking my head in confusion. The image in the mirror was mine, but there was something different about it, something that didn't quite align. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I saw a shadow move behind me, a dark shape that didn't belong. My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the basement. Just the weight of silence pressing in on me. I stepped back, suddenly aware of the way the room seemed to close in around me. My gaze shifted to the shelves lining the walls. Old books and dusty trinkets sat untouched, as though they hadn't been disturbed in years. But something caught my eye, a small, weathered box tucked behind a pile of forgotten objects. The box was simple, made of aged wood, its surface marked with faded symbols that looked almost like a language I didn't recognize. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, pulling it out from the shadows. The moment my hand touched the box, I felt it, an unmistakable sensation, like a jolt of electricity coursing through my veins. The air seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping even further. The basement, already suffocating in its cold, now felt like a tomb. A deep, unsettling hum vibrated in the walls, a sound that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. I almost dropped the box in shock, but I managed to steady my hand. Something about this box, this object, felt important, as though it held the key to the mansion's dark past. I turned the box over in my hands, studying its worn surface. There was no obvious latch or lock, but I could feel a faint, almost imperceptible shift beneath my fingers. I gently pressed on the center of the box, and it clicked open, revealing a collection of items inside: old papers, a few faded photographs, and a strange object wrapped in a cloth. I hesitated before pulling it free, carefully unwrapping the cloth to reveal a small, tarnished key. The key was simple in design, but its weight in my palm felt heavier than it should have been. I looked down at the photographs, each one taken from a different era of the mansion's history. The people in the pictures looked familiar, my ancestors, no doubt, but their expressions were stiff, uncomfortable, as though they were being forced to pose for something they didn't understand. The dates on the backs of the photos were all from the early 1900s, but one photo in particular caught my attention. It was of the mansion's grand foyer, just like the one I had entered earlier, but in the photograph, the space was filled with life, guests mingling, a party in full swing. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But as I studied the picture more closely, I saw something strange, an odd, shadowy figure lurking in the background, barely visible between the guests. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, and its shape seemed to distort unnaturally, its face hidden in the darkness. My fingers lingered over the photograph, my breath caught in my throat. This was no ordinary photograph, it was a warning. I set the photograph down and picked up the next piece of paper, a faded journal entry, written in the same hand as the one I had found earlier. The words were shaky, hurried, as though the writer had been in a state of panic. The house is not what it seems. There is something in the walls, something ancient. It calls to us in our sleep, whispers through the floors. I've seen it, heard it. The mirror in the basement, do not look into it. It shows the truth, the things that are hidden from us. We must leave before it's too late. I fear I am already too late. A chill ran through me as I read the words. The mirror in the basement. The shadow in the photograph. Everything was starting to make sense, in a way that terrified me. My hand gripped the box tighter as a horrifying realization settled over me. This house had always been cursed, from the very moment it was built. It had been waiting for someone to return, waiting for me. I shoved the box back into the shadows, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here any longer, not with the weight of the mansion's dark history pressing down on me. But as I turned to leave, I felt it, a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The room was empty. The shadows shifted, but no one stood there. The basement seemed to close in on me as I raced back up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I had discovered something I wasn't supposed to know. But the mansion wasn't done with me yet. The truth had only begun to reveal itself, and I could feel its cold fingers tightening around me. The house seemed to breathe around me. The creaking floors, the heavy silence, and the cold drafts that slipped through the walls, everything about the mansion felt alive, aware of my every move. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong choice, to slip further into its grasp. It had already revealed a small fraction of its secrets to me, but I knew there was more lurking in the shadows, more that I wasn't ready to face. Yet, I had come this far. I had uncovered too much already to turn back now. The air in the mansion had grown thicker since I found the box in the basement, the sensation of something pressing in on me from all sides growing with every passing minute. The mirror, the photographs, the journal entries, each clue pointed toward something darker, something that stretched far beyond the realm of the ordinary. The mansion wasn't just decaying, it was waiting. And now, I felt its hunger, like an animal drawn to my presence. I made my way back to the main floor, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The sense of quiet had become oppressive, suffocating, and the more I explored, the more the house seemed to shift around me. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen another living soul here. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself. The loneliness of the house, the shadows that stretched too long, of course, they would make me feel like something was lurking, like the house itself was alive. But then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, like a soft murmur in the distance. I paused, straining to hear, but there was nothing. The house was still. I convinced myself it was nothing, just the wind rustling through the trees outside, the creaking of the old wood settling in the cold. But as I moved deeper into the house, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, and they began to form words. Come back, we're waiting. I froze in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was so close, yet there was no one in sight. The whispers seemed to swirl around me, as if the very walls were speaking, echoing with 1,000 voices. The chill in the air seemed to deepen, the temperature dropping rapidly as if the house itself was exhaling its cold breath directly onto my skin. I reached for the doorknob of the nearest room, desperate for something familiar to anchor myself, but as my hand touched it, the whispers intensified. It was as though the house had sensed my intentions and was determined to stop me. The door, which had previously been ajar, slammed shut with a deafening bang. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to think. The air around me felt heavier, charged with an unseen force. The whispers were no longer distant. They were inside my head, pulling at the edges of my consciousness, urging me to turn around, to leave. But there was something else now, something that made my skin crawl, a feeling of dread that gnawed at my insides. It was the unmistakable sense that I wasn't alone in the house. Not in the way I had felt before, but something else was here with me. Something that wasn't just in my mind. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, moving with a will of their own, and from the corner of my eye, I could just make out the faint outline of someone, lurking in the dark. But whenever I turned my head to look, there was nothing there. I turned and ran down the hall, my footsteps pounding in the silence, my breath ragged as I stumbled through the maze of rooms. I needed to get out, needed to find the door, the way out of this nightmare. But the house had other plans. As I passed the grand staircase, I caught sight of the reflection in the hallway mirror. It was only for a second, but it stopped me cold. A figure stood at the top of the stairs, tall, dark, and impossibly thin. The figure didn't move, didn't even blink. It simply stood there, watching me. I could feel its gaze even though I couldn't see its face. It wasn't just the reflection that unsettled me, it was the way the figure seemed to belong in the mirror but not in the world around me. The mirror was a portal, a boundary between here and whatever lay beyond. Before I could process what I was seeing, the figure vanished, leaving only my wide-eyed reflection staring back at me, frozen in place. I stumbled backward, my mind spinning as I tried to make sense of what I had just witnessed. My breathing was ragged, my chest tight. The room around me seemed to close in, the walls pressing forward as if the house itself were alive and angry, waiting for me to make the next wrong move. Then, a sound cut through the silence. It was faint at first, just a soft scraping noise, like nails on wood. But it was coming closer. I didn't have to look to know what it was. The sound was unmistakable, the scraping of something heavy, dragging across the floor. I turned, my heart skipping a beat as I saw it, something moving down the hallway, dragging itself toward me. A long, twisted shape, crawling across the floor with a sickening, scraping sound. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see the shadows moving, twitching, as the shape grew closer. It was enormous, its form distorted and unnatural. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor, unable to move. The figure in the hall seemed to slither, a grotesque, writhing mass of darkness, and as it neared, I could hear its breathing, a low, gurgling sound, wet and labored. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping sharply as the figure drew closer. I could feel its presence now, a weight pressing down on me, suffocating, as though the house itself were closing in. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into thin air, leaving me trembling, my skin covered in a cold sweat. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. The mansion's oppressive presence seemed to grow even more intense, like a living thing, suffocating me with its dark embrace. The house was no longer just old and abandoned, it was alive, hungry, and it wanted something from me. I didn't know what, but I knew it wouldn't stop until it had it. I bolted for the nearest door, the one leading to the kitchen, hoping it would offer some reprieve from the madness. But when I stepped inside, I was met with another sight that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted in what appeared to be blood. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the remnants of something long dead. The countertops, once pristine, were now covered in dust and dried stains. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the photograph on the table. I had seen that photo before, the one of my ancestors, standing proudly in front of the mansion, their faces cold and unfeeling. But this was different. In this version of the photo, the shadows behind the family were darker, more pronounced, and there was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. In the background, a figure stood in the doorway, its face obscured by shadows. It was tall, with long, ragged hair and a twisted smile that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. And there, in the corner of the photo, was a small, almost imperceptible detail that made my blood run cold, a dark, slithering shape, creeping across the floor, just like the one I had seen in the hallway. The whispers returned, louder now, filling my ears with their insistent, maddening call. I slammed the photo face down onto the table, my hands shaking as I backed away. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this house before it swallowed me whole. But the door slammed shut behind me, and I knew, deep down, that there was no way out anymore. The moment the door slammed shut behind me, I knew there was no turning back. The house had me. I could feel it deep in my bones, a suffocating presence closing in on me. Every wall, every shadow, every creak of the floorboards seemed to be watching, waiting for the moment I would break. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I pressed my back to the kitchen table, the photographs, the symbols, the unnatural shapes swirling in my mind. It was no longer just a place of decaying walls and forgotten memories. The mansion itself had turned into something far more sinister. This wasn't a house, it was a living, breathing thing, alive with centuries of malevolent energy. And I had awakened it. I backed away from the table, my hands trembling as I glanced around the room. The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe in the dim light, twisting and contorting as if they were moving of their own accord. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, heavier than before, as if the house had drawn in the very breath from my lungs. The whispers were back, louder now, louder than my own racing thoughts. "You can't escape. You belong to us now." I tried to steady myself, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening, but there was no explanation. The very foundation of this place, this mansion, was built on something ancient, something evil. The spirits that roamed its halls, my ancestors, the ones who had lived and died here, they were no longer resting. They were trapped, bound to this house, bound to me, and the more I uncovered, the deeper I dug, the more I realized that my return had been the catalyst for all of this. And that's when I saw it. The mirror. The mirror in the basement. The one I had been so drawn to earlier, the one I had been warned about. The one I had not wanted to understand. But now, it stood in front of me, uninvited, as if the house itself had summoned it to challenge me. I hadn't seen it in the kitchen, but now, it was there, tall, dark, its surface gleaming like a pool of black water. "Look into it," the whispers urged, as though they had become a part of my thoughts. "Look into the mirror. See the truth." I didn't want to. I knew what it would show me, more than I could bear. But the pull was irresistible, like the tide dragging me out to sea, no matter how hard I tried to fight it. Slowly, unwillingly, I walked toward it, my steps heavy, my mind screaming for me to stop, but I couldn't. I stood in front of the mirror, my hands at my sides, my reflection staring back at me. But it wasn't just my reflection. The mirror distorted it, twisted it, until I could barely recognize myself. My face seemed to melt away, replaced by a shadowy version of me, hollow eyes staring from the depths, a grin stretching impossibly wide. And then, I saw them. The figures behind me. At first, I thought they were just more distortions, more tricks of the light, the shadows playing with my mind. But as my gaze drifted upward, I saw their faces, familiar faces. My ancestors. They stood in the reflection, all of them, their faces blank and emotionless, their eyes fixed on me, unblinking. I tried to turn, to look at them, but the moment I did, they were gone. No one was in the room with me, just the empty silence, the echo of my own breathing. But the reflection remained. In the mirror, the figures were still there, watching, waiting. Their eyes were no longer vacant, they were full of something dark, something sinister, something that hadn't been there before. I could feel it. It wasn't just the house's curse anymore. It was their curse, their legacy, something they had left behind, something they had passed down to me, unwillingly. And then it happened. The figure in the reflection, the twisted, shadowy version of myself, reached out toward me. I gasped, stumbling backward, but it was too late. The hand in the mirror moved. It reached beyond the glass, stretching toward me with an unnatural speed, its fingers long and sharp, its skin gray and wrinkled as though it were rotting. I tried to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I felt cold fingers wrap around my wrist, pulling me toward the mirror, dragging me closer to the glass. Come back, come back. The whispers coiled around me, suffocating me. My heart pounded in my chest, my body stiff with terror. I tried to pull away, to escape the grasp of the shadowy hand, but it was impossible. The mirror had become a doorway, a portal, and I was being sucked into it, pulled into the darkness that lurked within. The walls around me began to blur, and the room dissolved into shadows. I reached out, desperate for something solid, but there was nothing. The house was slipping away, and in its place, I saw an endless void, dark and cold, stretching out before me. The whispers surrounded me, louder now, like 1,000 voices screaming, chanting, demanding that I join them. You belong to us. The darkness closed in, the cold fingers around my wrist tightening, and for a brief moment, I thought I was lost. Gone. Forever. But then, just as suddenly, the grip loosened. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my heart racing as I fell to the floor. The mirror, now silent, reflected only my trembling form. The room was still. The shadows no longer writhed. The whispers had stopped. But I knew it wasn't over. I had come face to face with something I couldn't fully understand, something that the mansion had hidden for so long. And now, it was awake. It had been waiting for me to uncover its secrets, to unleash its curse. And I had. I had done it. I was the catalyst. And I could feel it deep within my bones. The mansion had changed me, had bound me to it. I could never leave. I scrambled to my feet, my body weak, my head spinning, and I ran for the front door, determined to escape, to break free. But as I reached for the handle, I felt the weight of the house around me, a force pressing down on my chest. The door wouldn't open. I twisted the knob again and again, my panic growing, but it was as if the mansion itself had locked me in. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling my head with their maddening chorus. You can never leave. You belong to us now. I turned, desperate for another way out, but there was none. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I knew, in that moment, that the mansion had claimed me, just as it had claimed those before me. The shadowy figures in the mirror, they were waiting. They would always be waiting, and I would never escape. The mansion would keep me here, forever, trapped between time and space, caught in the endless cycle of its dark, cursed history. I was part of it now, and no one would ever know the truth. The mansion was silent now, or at least it seemed that way. I sat on the floor of the hallway, my back pressed against the cold, crumbling wall, struggling to catch my breath. The weight in my chest had not lifted. The suffocating presence that had once been just a feeling now hung like a thick, suffocating cloud around me, pressing against every inch of my skin. It was as if the house itself had become a part of me, entwined with my soul. I couldn't escape it, not physically, not mentally. I had become an unwilling part of its dark, twisted history. The door still would not open. I had tried everything, twisting the knob, banging my fists against it, even kicking it, but nothing worked. The house had locked me in, and no matter how much I raged against it, I was still here. My heart raced, but there was no way out. Not now. Not anymore. I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me, my fingers grazing the walls as I wandered through the hall. The air was colder than before. My breath fogged in front of me, but the temperature wasn't what bothered me most. No, it was the sense that the mansion had become a living, breathing entity, watching me, knowing me. There was no escaping that reality. The whispers were still with me, lingering in the back of my mind, calling me, beckoning me into the shadows where they would consume me whole. I had done everything to survive, to fight back, but the mansion had already claimed me. There was no denying it. The truth of it sat heavy in the pit of my stomach. The reflection in the mirror had not just been a warning, it had been a promise. The house had claimed its latest victim, and that victim was me. The truth had been inescapable from the beginning. I had been drawn to this place by something I could not understand, something that had reached out through time and space to pull me in. I thought I was simply investigating an abandoned house, uncovering its dark secrets. But the secrets weren't meant to be uncovered. They were meant to stay buried, locked away in the heart of the mansion. But I had disturbed that peace. I had unraveled the threads that held the darkness at bay, and now I was paying the price. I walked through the empty halls, my footsteps echoing in the vast silence, and as I did, I saw them again. The figures. At first, they were just glimpses out of the corner of my eye, standing in doorways or watching me from the shadows. But soon, they became more than just fleeting images. They were there, standing right in front of me, their eyes hollow and dark, their expressions empty. My ancestors. The ones who had once lived here, the ones who had died here, their spirits trapped in this place. They were still here, bound to the mansion by forces beyond understanding. Their faces were twisted in silent sorrow, their eyes never meeting mine. They didn't speak, but I could feel their presence, their cold, unfeeling gaze watching me, knowing that I was now one of them. I tried to call out, to beg for answers, to ask them why this was happening, but they didn't answer. They simply stood there, silent and still. It was as though they were waiting for me to understand, waiting for me to accept my fate. I had been chosen, just as they had. The house had claimed me, and there was no escape. No one would ever know what had really happened here. No one would understand the darkness that lay within the walls of the mansion. It would remain hidden, a cursed secret, locked away for all eternity. The house seemed to hum, a low, eerie vibration beneath the floorboards, as if it were alive, pulsating with its own dark energy. The shadows stretched longer, moving across the walls like living things, crawling with malevolent intent. The mansion had a life of its own, a pulse that throbbed through every room, every corner, every inch of space. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but I didn't have the strength to run anymore. There was no place to run. The mansion was everywhere now. I could feel its cold fingers brushing against my skin, its weight pressing against me from all sides. I had become a part of it, and it would never let me go. I turned, desperate for anything familiar, anything that would remind me of the world outside. The kitchen, the place where I had first found the photograph, seemed like a distant memory now. I walked slowly, my feet dragging across the dust-covered floor, as though the house itself was trying to keep me in place, to make me accept what I had become. The photograph. I remembered the photo on the table in the kitchen, the one that had haunted me from the moment I first saw it. The photo of my ancestors, standing proudly in front of the mansion, their faces cold and emotionless. But the photo I had seen before was different now. The figures in the image seemed to have shifted, their faces more twisted, more distorted, as if the very fabric of time had been altered. I reached the kitchen, my breath shallow, and my eyes locked on the photo. But it wasn't just the photo that caught my attention. It was the reflection in the glass. The reflection wasn't mine. It was someone else, someone I didn't recognize. A face, twisted and deformed, staring back at me with eyes that were hollow, empty, and full of endless, suffocating darkness. The photo, like everything else, had changed. The mansion was changing me. I could feel it seeping into my very soul, corrupting me, twisting me into something that wasn't human anymore. Something that belonged to the house. I backed away from the table, my hands trembling as I turned to leave. But when I tried to open the door, I found it locked again, the knob cold under my fingertips. The mansion had sealed itself shut, as though it had decided that I was never going to leave. I wasn't supposed to leave. No one ever did. The whispers were louder now, more insistent. You belong to us. You are one of us now. Forever. I sank to the floor, my knees giving way beneath me as I let the weight of it all crash down on me. The mansion had taken everything, my freedom, my mind, my very soul. I was no longer a visitor. I was a permanent fixture, just like the shadows, just like the spirits that had once walked these halls. I was a part of the house, bound to it in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. There would be no rescue. There would be no way out. I had thought that uncovering the mansion's secrets would set me free, but now I understood. There was no freedom here. There was only the endless cycle of darkness. The mansion's curse had claimed me, just as it had claimed those before me, and just as it would claim those who would come after me. It was an unbroken chain, stretching out across time, and I was now one of the ghosts that haunted its halls. I sat there in the cold, listening to the whispers, feeling the mansion's pulse throb through me. There was nothing more I could do. I had become part of the story now, part of the legend of the haunted mansion. And as I sank deeper into the darkness, I could only hope that someone like me, would one day come looking for answers. But even they wouldn't escape.